D'être ici. Et comme tu connais encore, je ne parle pas français. Alors, nous allons faire la présentation en anglais, mais tu peux participer dans la discussion en anglais ou français comme tu veux. So we're going to begin with what will be a rapid run-through of nuclear waste long-term management and challenges. And we've got a cram-packed hour, and we want to get through the presentations, of course, in less than 40 minutes, so we have time for discussion. So Diane and I are going to go back and forth, but our objective really is to set the context and update, provide an update and an overview on where we're at with nuclear waste, irradiated fuel waste, and the challenges in its isolation and management in the longer term. So Diane is going to begin.
How am I starting here? Okay. So what is the waste that we're talking about? Mainly, we're focusing on nuclear power, although, as I hope everybody knows, nuclear power, nuclear weapons are the same fuel chain. And nuclear, this is what's that?
That's uranium tailings at Elliott Lake.
That wasn't in there?
It's an animation.
But how do we...
Keep going. It's all right.
I don't know how.
The arrow down. No.
Oh, there we go. I did it. Okay. All right. So irradiated fuel. So yeah, it all starts with uranium. That was that, right? Uranium mines? All right. Irradiated fuel from the core of nuclear reactors is what our main focus is. But I'll do a quick fuel chain review, which is, as we know, uranium in the ground. It's not that concentrated in uranium-235, but uranium-235 is there. So the goal of the nuclear fuel chain is to concentrate that uranium-235. The uranium is mined in various different ways, and then it is milled and then refined and converted into a gas so that the uranium-235s can be concentrated, and the other uraniums that are just as deadly but are called depleted uranium are separated out and then converted back to a solid into fuel assemblies. And for the reactors in the U.S., we have 10-foot-long fuel assemblies, 10-foot pencil-thin rods, a couple hundred rods per assembly, and then a couple hundred assemblies in the core of a reactor. And then gets to be millions of times more radioactive when it comes out of the core. Lethal dose upon exposure. So there's no way they can lie about the danger of the irradiated fuel when it comes out of the reactor, because it has to be isolated. And it remains dangerous for millions of years. Some of the isotopes. So I think there are more reactors than this picture shows in the world. There are about 400 plus reactors, each generating high-level radioactive waste. And we shared making these. What did you want to say about this? Just go. Okay, many radionuclides are formed when the uranium is split. It splits into fission products, cesium, strontium, iodines, very biologically active elements.
Click once more, it'll do the chain.
And then uranium itself it lasts a long time, and it decays into other radioactive elements. It's two different concepts at the same time here, of the uranium itself and how long it lasts, and what it turns into, eventually lead. And going back to the other one, though, in the core of the reactor, the uranium, it either splits to form cesium, strontium, iodines. Its binding energy heats the water, turns the turbines, makes the electricity. And then some of the uraniums are hit by a neutron, absorb that neutron, and form heavier elements like transuranic elements like plutonium. And that's formed in the reactor. And in the weapons reactors, the goal is to make as much plutonium as possible. And in the power reactors, it's to make as much splitting of the uranium atoms as possible. So it turns out that the power fuel, when it comes out of the core, is much, much hotter. In fact, I'll show you a slide later that it's got 99% of the radioactivity in the whole nuclear fuel chain from nuclear power and weapons is in the irradiated fuel from nuclear power. And other workshops have talked about how radiation affects us, concentrates in the various different organs. Iodine goes to the thyroid, cesium goes to the muscles, and strontium goes to the bone, causing leukemia and bone cancers. And women are 50% more likely to get cancer from the same amount of radiation as men, and baby girls and baby boys more than adults, and the fetus even more. And so baby girls are the most affected, most likely to get cancer from radiation exposure. Sorry about that.
So we're going to each do a quick overview per country, and so I'm going to talk just briefly about the Canadian situation. So in Canada, the industry to date has produced 50,000 tons of highly radioactive nuclear waste. So in Canada, if we call it high-level waste, we're talking about the fuel waste. Even though some of the intermediate level is as radioactive as the fuel waste, those would be things like the reactor core in a refurbishment, some of the resins, and so on from operating. But if it's in Canada, if we call it high-level waste, we're talking about the fuel waste. So with 50,000 tons, right now the waste is all at the reactor stations. So it goes from, it's in the uranium bundle goes in, 18 months in the reactor, comes out, it's in the pool, the irradiated fuel bay, for industry says 8 to 10 years. Then they say, the line is, then it moves to dry cask storage. Our reactor stations in Canada are concentrated mostly in Ontario. There's one in Gentilly, Quebec, that has been announced for permanent shutdown and decommissioning. And in Pointe-le-Preau, there is a single reactor that seems to be mostly in long-term maintenance. The status of storage in Canada. So I said industry says that it's got this nice tiny routine of in the reactor, then in the pool, then boom, 8 to 10 years it goes to dry storage. In fact, that's not the case. That's the standard industry description. But in fact, the majority of the waste in Canada, in Ontario, and Canada more generally, is staying in the pools for a much, much longer time. Industry, we've asked Ontario Power Generation directly, what is the criteria for making your decisions about at what point that fuel moves from the irradiated fuel bay for dry storage? They don't have one. So 2/3 of the waste, and we did these numbers, these just really simple calculation looking at the inventory from 2012. And you can see, so these numbers, if I walk away, I'll walk away from the mic, but I'll do it anyway. So that's 10 years out, that's 1 year's output, so that's 10 years output. So if they were really taking the waste out of the bay at the 10-year interval, this bar and this bar would match, but they don't, because most of the waste is still in the pool. And one of the many lessons from Fukushima, I think, is that the fuel is very vulnerable in the pool. But industry has this standard description, which is really in conflict with their standard practice. Their standard practice is to leave it in the pool for much longer, where it needs very active management, continual input of water and power. So the industry in Canada, as in many other countries, has a plan to bury this highly radioactive waste. And they've had this plan for a long time. 1977, 3 men, 3 months, Hare Commission, did a study, and voila, decided that the best way to deal with this waste in the longer term was to bury it in the Canadian Shield, which is the rocky formations from all of northern Ontario, my region, but most of northern Canada. And they would bury it 500 to 1,000 meters below the surface in a copper or titanium container. That was the subject. It became called the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's Geological Disposal Concept, subject to a 10-year review And the core question for that review panel was, has Atomic Energy of Canada Limited demonstrated the geological disposal concept to be safe and acceptable? And a 10-year review, a 400-page report, summarized the answer, no. ACL had not demonstrated safety or acceptability. They do have something in the report that for a conceptual, technically feasible for a conceptual stage of development, which the industry clamped onto and calls that an approval. I call it the faint praise approval. It said nobody proved absolutely that that design would fail faster and more furiously than ACL had already admitted to in the 3 years of hearings. They did say, in questioning and Ganoogaming First Nation from a school child, an 8-year-old boy, was the first person to get ACL to admit that, yes, there would be releases of radionuclide from that waste stashed at depth. And the question, the debate in that hearing wasn't whether the ACL concept would fail, but how soon, how much, and with what effect. They said 3 deaths per million. We, at the end, in a dark humor moment, said we could accept that number if we got to choose which 3. So 10 years later, the industry released their next great idea, which the graphic artist must have been on a long-term retainer because it looks just the same. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, established completely contrary to the Seaborne Panel Commission recommendation, the federal government did not establish the independent panel, independent agency. They established an organization funded by, formed by, completely controlled by the waste generators. That's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. 2002, they were formed. 2005, they submitted a report recommending an almost identical proposal for burial, except they broadened their search. Any rock will do. And they now include the sedimentary rocks of southern Ontario and the Canadian Shield. 2005, they submitted it. 2007, the federal government said, go ahead. This paves the way for the expansion and continuation of the industry, proving our point again. 2010, they released a siting process, 10-step siting process, which we're now 5 years into. We had 22 communities listed by the industry. Councillors, mayor, economic development officer put their hands up and said, yeah, we'd like to learn about that. Capital L, capital M, learn more means you're in the NWMO study. We're now down to 6 communities in Northern Ontario and 3 in the shadow of the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. Different rules for the northern communities than for the southern communities. You can see this is the land withdrawals for the northern communities. So we've got 6 municipalities offered to be studied. 22 candidate areas have been withdrawn, none of them within the boundaries of the municipality that offered up to be studied. None of them. So for these, on the north shore of Lake Huron, the municipalities are down here, the candidate areas are here, municipalities are here, here, and here, candidate areas are here. So not one, not that the councils have any authority anyway under Canadian law, but not one study area in Northern Ontario is within their municipal boundaries. First Nations across Northern Ontario, every treaty area, it's all treaty land, and every treaty organization and the individual First Nations have said, no. No, don't even study us, don't even come. But the industry, but the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is very much there. Diane.
So this is obviously a fresh fuel. Oh, this was a fresh fuel rod, or the person would be dead because you can't be standing next to the fuel when it comes out of the reactor. In the U.S., I was mentioning earlier that, and I think it's the same internationally, that the bottom one is a pie chart showing the radioactivity. The radioactivity in nuclear waste, that the bulk of it, that big dark amount, is in irradiated commercial fuel, and the rest of it would be in weapons fuel, and also the same elements that are in high-level waste, the cesium, the strontium, the iodines, neptunium, all that. As long as it stays in the fuel rod, it's high-level waste. But these rods get pinhole pricks, they get cracks, and as soon as that plutonium atom leaks out of the fuel rod, presto, in the United States anyway, it is now low-level radioactive waste. So low-level waste has all the same elements as high-level waste. It's just in a different concentration and a different relationship. So we have 99% of the radioactivity in the commercial fuel. In the U.S., we have now operating or able to operate 99 nuclear reactors, and there's 27 that are closed. And this is sort of a visual of where the waste is right now. It's mostly at reactors. We have some that's centralized at weapons sites like 3 Mile Island. They took the fuel from 3 Mile Island, the Corps, and brought it out to Idaho to study it and store it there. And we have about a dozen nuclear weapons sites. 3 or 4 of those have high-level waste. In the irradiated fuel, okay, so when the irradiated fuel comes out of the reactor, it's in the pools. For a while in the U.S., as we were building up, I think probably nationally, more and more fuel was put into the pools far beyond what they were originally designed to hold. They tried they would re-rack it, so more racks of fuel, more fuel assemblies could go into the core of the reactors, pools, the fuel pools. In the reactors. They also tried to disassemble the assemblies and push the rods closer together so they could fit more into the pools. And it's more than they were designed to hold, the weight and the radioactivity. So then they started moving into dry casks. And the dry casks are probably less bad than in the pools, because if a pool has a leak, it could self-melt. And there's in these pools that have had fuel for many years, for many cores worth of fuel, they've got obviously more radioactivity than the reactor core, because they've got all the cores from all those years of operation. So they move from the dry casks that they've put into. Let's see. I'll talk about the casks in a while, but the choices are stored in the pools, move it into dry casks, and then reprocessing, which we did try in the United States, and it was a big failure, and we don't know what to do with that waste either. So we had in the U.S. a siting program. It started in 1982 and 1987. We had nuclear waste laws that passed in Congress directing siting of nuclear repositories. We were supposed to have one in the East and one in the West, and then it was an election year, and nobody who was running for office wanted to have this on their responsibility, so Congress changed the law, and they picked the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada. It was called the Screw Nevada Bill, and then decades later, when Nevada said no, they vetoed it, and Congress overrode the veto. The Screw Nevada 2 bill was passed because Nevada has fewer representatives and senators than most of the other states. So Yucca, up until now, is supposed to be our answer. This is Yucca. It was studied for several years. When Obama came in, and it had many technical problems. It had high earthquake risk, volcano risk. The hydrology was such that it was going to leak. So the Environmental Protection Agency rules had to be changed 2 or 3 times to meet the mountain, because the mountain couldn't meet the regs, and still it is not going to isolate the waste. A few years ago, 200 organizations petitioned to disqualify Yucca Mountain technically, and the main reasons, as I said, were the volcanoism, the earthquake risk, the hydrology. It didn't meet the criteria. And we petitioned to the Department of Energy to go ahead legally and technically to disqualify Yucca Mountain. If they had done that, it would have saved them 15 years and billions of dollars, but they did not do that. So, so what they did do was to continue up until Obama came in, and he and the Secretary of Energy at that point canceled the Yucca Mountain project. Now, let's see, where's the Blue Ribbon Commission? So Yucca was canceled and the law required an alternative plan. So what the president did was to appoint a Blue Ribbon Commission to look at America's nuclear future, America's nuclear waste future, and everybody on it was pro-nuclear, and they came out with a recommendation that we look for, when we set up an independent commission, not the Department of Energy to look for a dump, that we look for centralized interim storage place, while we also look for a permanent disposal place, and that we look for volunteer communities. We require that there be consent, and so there's some struggling now with the definition of consent in a community, and we're saying, well, I hope that that means that people who don't consent will not have to take a nuclear dump. So over the decades, these are not in the order of my brain. Let's see. I'm almost done. Okay, so over the years, the concept of centralized interim storage, on the older days it was called away from reactor storage, and this was a plan to take waste from reactors and move it to a centralized place. That they searched around for those. Tennessee was targeted, West Virginia for a while. It did not proceed. We do have a place in Illinois that does have some commercial fuel at the Morris, Illinois reprocessing plant that never operated, but other than that, the waste is at reactors around the country. And later on, they came back with the same idea of centralized storage, and it was called MRS, Monitored Retrievable Storage. This was defeated. And now the idea is consolidated interim storage, or CIS. That's what they're looking for now. It's the same old thing, just trying to find a place to move the irradiated fuel from the reactors. And in doing so, one of the big incentives is that they would shift the liability and the responsibility for the waste from the nuclear utilities and the private companies that own them to the U.S. taxpayers. So we're going to end up owning it anyway. It's part of the deal because we need to have the plutonium in this stuff owned by the government, but there is no permanent place for it, and the temporary will become de facto permanent, and it's an unnecessary transport risk. Let me do this here. So there's a few different schemes right now. The government, as they're thinking about moving legislation that would set up looking for an interim storage site, there's a company that runs a so-called low-level radioactive waste dump in Texas that is teaming up with Areva to propose the interim storage site in Texas. And the community there has been very oppressed. The people who oppose it are not allowed to speak out, and so it looks like consent maybe. They're also getting paid a certain percent of the waste that comes into the community and into the state of Texas. So we have Yucca Mountain still on the docket. The president said no to it. We have, that would be the permanent dump. The goal of the public interest movement at this point is to get Yucca off the table completely, and to prevent any other interim sites, to really stop making more of it, and to prevent transport back and forth to a supposedly interim site. Are we coming up to something for you here? Yeah.
So, a common theme in the US and Canada and many other countries over the decades is the end of the day, it's a dump. So deep geologic repositories are the industry's end goal, and regulators have accepted that. But after 30 years of this, 40 in some countries, high-level nuclear fuel waste has not been buried anywhere in the world. And so one of the goals is certainly to continue that fine tradition of not burying it anywhere in the world. But I'm going to talk just briefly about the sort of the fundamentals from, largely an industry perspective, but how do they talk about this and what are some of the issues with that? So across these several different programs, there's some common language, and part of the common language is it's called a multiple barrier concept. So the idea is that you've got layers and layers. Industry has this lingo of defense in depth. Well, this is sort of defense in depth sideways. So a multiple barrier concept suggests that you have the fuel the fuel has its own barrier, then you've got a container, then you've got a packing or a buffer material, and then you've got the geology, the rock. That's the industry line on it. So the multiple barrier concept. We have all these, and there are a number of design or engineering elements that are common throughout many or perhaps all of the program. This comes from a workshop I did a few years ago where we were analyzing the Canadian concept in particular, but these are common elements. So the waste, then waste access, containers, the method of placement, the spacing of the waste within that deep repository, backfilling and monitoring. Those are common elements. So in all of and we're going to look at a couple of examples internationally. So in all of these designs, there are those common elements. They appear, but they vary from one program to another, and they are in greatly different states of development. And I would say in the Canadian case, they're all ideas. It's in Canada, it's maybe everywhere, it's reference. So it's a reference case. We have reference cases, we have reference studies, which means they're not really committed to that. It's how they're going to describe it for right now so they can crank out a couple of binders, send it to the regulator, negotiate a pre-approval, and when they get to the final stages of their siting process, they'll have most of their work done based on these reference designs. So there are issues with each element of that multiple barrier concept. And I'm just going to reference a couple of good resources on this, and there are more, but I found these two to be the sort of the most helpful in terms of, for a non-technical person like myself, to be able to actually work through these issues. So some of the issues with each of those barriers, there are issues. So we talk about the fuel. Well, the fuel is supposed to be the first barrier, but we have, particularly in Canada, as we have aging reactors, we have an increasing frequency of fuel defects. And those fuel defects will impair or reduce the ability of that fuel bundle itself to provide any kind of barrier. It loses its integrity in terms of keeping the elements contained. So then we move to the container. And in Canada and several other countries, copper is the preferred. In Canada, they haven't committed copper, steel, but copper is the standard reference. There are real issues with corrosion of those copper containers, and the closer Sweden gets to actually, as they go through the licensing process, we've got more careful, detailed research into that corrosion and the abilities of the copper containers to actually isolate the waste. And what's been determined or what's been identified is that the corrosion is actually happening at a much more rapid rate than was earlier predicted. So the corrosion's not going so well. The backfill studies, and this is mostly as summarized in Rock Solid. So the backfill is a buffer. So in Canada, it's a bentonite clay mixed with sand, no definition. So the industry always says, well, we'll have a clay buffer. But it's not a clay buffer, it's a clay-sand mix. And across percentages of clay in that clay-sand mix. And I'd really like to see a number that says, if all these programs went forward and they all used a pure bentonite mix, where would where are bentonite reserves to actually sustain that? And I think they're not there. But they say it's bentonite, it's actually bentonite sand mix, but lab studies are showing that when you use the bentonite in this kind of condition where you have heat, radioactivity, and the underground environment, and it's mostly, I think, because of the heat, for the bentonite to work, it has to be exposed to water, it swells, it fills the space. But if you have a drying out effect from the heat, the bentonite doesn't swell and it's actually not retarding. Its job is to catch those radionuclides on their way through. Lab studies show that's actually not the case. It's not actually performing that function as previously described. Then there's a whole bunch of issues around solubility and transport. And when you get into an underground environment, you have this mix of influences. So you have heat, you have radioactivity, you have microbial activity, you have corrosion. All of those combine. You'll have gas generation because as the metal corrodes it and combines with the organic elements, you have gas generation. And all of those combine together and increase the outward force, increase the possibility, increase the avenues, the routes out for those radionuclides out to the external environment. So if the goal of long-term management is isolation, what we can say right now is that the safety case has definitely not been made for geological repositories because we have a large basket of uncertainties. So how soon, how effective those repository designs will be in isolating the waste is undetermined. But the safety case is a set of technical arguments the proponent has to put forward in any licensing process, and the safety case has not been made. And, you know, we looked at all these issues in the 1990s for the geological disposal concept brought forward by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. And now here we are 20 years later, and the issues are all the same. They're just more detailed. Nothing's been taken off the table. None of these issues have been retired. We've said, oh, yeah, that's solved. Then there are a whole bunch of issues around. The safety case relies basically on computer modeling. So we're relying on a computer program to make predictions about how this design is going to operate over eternity. I work a lot in forest management planning, and we assume that the models are good for 10 years, give you a general feeling for 50 years, and forget about it at 100 years. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, and they're opaque in terms of the data that's gone in, the program design, and this couples within an overall problem, a really large and pervasive problem of a lack of peer review. These studies, most of the regulators are accepting the industry's assessment, and they might internally review it, but there's a real issue around lack of peer-reviewed studies. So there's one, in Canada we have no independent agency. We have no oversight of the industry separate from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and Natural Resources Canada, both of whom are strong supporters of not only the continuance of the industry, but the expansion. And the president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission barreled up to me at a conference a few years ago and shouted in my face, "Why don't you like deep geological repositories?" To which I said, it's not on the record that I don't. So I think he's been Googling me. So, very helpful summary report out of the UK a few years ago, because the tendency is to say, oh, well, we've got these uncertainties, so we have to do more study. Well, the UK did a quite helpful summary, but I think the most helpful point was their conclusion that says more work may or may not indicate that an acceptable safety case can be made. We can keep going down the same road, but the same dead end might be there because we're going down the same road over and over again. So just a quick overview of where countries are at. Germany, preferred media is salt. They restarted a couple of years ago. This is all from a 2012 summary. So somebody in the audience might be much more current on each of these countries than I am. But they, in 2009, decided to restart the research program. So they're not even to a siting process, but the basic assumption is salt. France, the basic assumption is they've selected a site, large, high level of local community opposition, and they're in the design stages of that process. United Kingdom, undetermined, a series of failed siting processes. The most recent was a quite enjoyable failure about 2 years ago when they had a volunteer siting process and a couple of communities came forward, and then the county council vetoed it. So they have a generic siting process and a general idea that they're looking for a volunteer community, but they haven't identified one. United States, Yucca Mountain, we've heard from Dee already, United States, Yucca Mountain, frozen out of the budget, and now they're looking at a consent-based process. Finland and Sweden, in Canada, we're always told about Sweden. Everybody's doing it, just look at Sweden. Finland and Sweden are the two farthest ahead. Finland actually did a site characterization, first constructed site characterization facility, and they have just got sort of, as I understand it, basically an approval in principle. They're going to apply for their operating license, estimated a 2020 application for their operating license. And that's when the rubber will really hit the road. That's when the actual proposal will have to be brought forward, those technical arguments made and scrutinized, and I expect possibly go the way of Sweden. So Sweden, SKB, we hear a lot about this in Canada, even though some fundamental aspects of the design are very different from the Canadian design. The shaft design is one example. But Sweden actually, SKB as the company, submitted the license application, I think it was 2012, and it was returned because additional work had to be done. In particular, the regulator said that the safety case had not been made, and in particular, the corrosion case had not been made. So that's gone back to SKB for additional work, and at last time I checked, had not yet surfaced again. So Sweden, the poster child for nuclear waste burial, is in a stall they've been in a stall for a while now. So there is no deep geologic repository operating anywhere in the world for high-level waste, for nuclear fuel waste. We've got a couple of examples. The only operating deep geologic repository is WIP for weapons waste in the US, and after a couple of incidents almost a year and a half ago, that repository was shut down. The waste is still in. Took a year to determine what actually caused the radioactive release, and it's still shut down. And then we have the poster child in Canada. We have a proposal for a deep geologic repository for so-called low and intermediate level waste at the Bruce. And we had Don Hancock from the Southwest Research Institute actually did a comparison, looked at OPG's argument, which was we have to bury it because that's the best practice internationally. So we have a helpful report from Don Hancock where he says there's no operating deep geologic repository anywhere in the world for low and intermediate level waste, and certainly not for high level waste. So we do have some examples of failed repositories. We have the Morsleben repository, the Assay repository, which were both for low and intermediate level waste, are in various stages of decommissioning, decontamination, and I don't know, maybe our German counterparts can give more detail on that, but basically they're failures. Summary, they're failures, they're having to be decommissioned, they're in different stages of that decommissioning, but the waste will have to be retrieved, repackaged, and so on. And then we have the waste isolation pilot plant in the US. There was an underground fire, then an explosion, and releases of radioactive elements to surface. Never supposed to happen at the WIP, and yet it happened. Leona? The fire was a truck. It was a truck. So a diesel truck, and just, I think it was, my understanding is poor maintenance. But what was really interesting about WIP from our perspective was the overall failure to be able to respond to the incidents. So the communication system didn't work. There was no clear evacuation plan. The information had to come from a agency separate from the Department of Energy. Lots of lessons learned there. So we have no operating deep geologic repository anywhere in the world, and we don't even have a developed licensed proposal. The one out in the front, Sweden, stalled and gone back to the proponent. D on transportation.
There were actually two things that happened at the waste isolation pilot plant a year ago, February. And so the first one was a truck, I think, was it a fire? Yeah. But the explosion on Valentine's Day, 2014, was because kitty litter type substance was used to hold the material, and apparently that is common sense in the world of people who understand how you store organic materials, that's not a good thing to do. So that material, so that barrel, one barrel supposedly exploded and has caused years and years, and it's now one of the Department of Energy's highest priorities, and they're funneling all kinds of money into getting that site back up and running because it is the only geologic repository, and they want to make sure that it can reopen. In the meantime, some of that waste is being brought over to the waste control specialist so-called low-level radioactive waste dump over in the same corridor of Texas, New Mexico for storage. But the danger of transporting this material back and forth is one that certainly led to some victories in Germany. People were able to stop a lot of nuclear waste moving around and eventually raising consciousness and stopping the reactors. Little help from Chernobyl and Fukushima. But in the U.S., our regulations require that canisters are designed to meet certain conditions that are much less than they would normally have to meet on regular roads and rails. They're required to withstand a 30-foot drop. It's a 30 or 60 mile per hour hit into a bridge abutment. A 90-minute submersion under a set depth of water, and over the years, the containers that are now in use have never been actually physically tested. It's all computer models to see if computer-wise they meet these conditions. So when you get the stuff on the roads and rails, it's not necessarily going to be able to withstand the real conditions. And the allowable exposure at the surface of these transport containers is such that it could actually cause health effects. They're not completely isolating the waste. The plan for a repository or even for centralized interim storage would mean tens of thousands of shipments on the roads and rails. It would shift from having this stuff as the cancers that they are at the 60 or 80 sites around the country to moving it back and forth across the country just to make room for more waste to be generated and to shift the liability to the taxpayers. So we also have I mentioned dangers of both routine releases from the containers, and if there were an accident. There have been several accidents that we know would have exceeded the requirements of the canisters. There was a big fire in Baltimore Tunnel. Had there been radioactive waste there, it would have wiped out Baltimore. There were a long fire. The other condition is that the casks have to withstand a fire at 1,475 degrees Fahrenheit, but the temperature that fuel burns is in the 1800s, so it's not even designed to withstand a fire that is very likely to happen. So routine exposures from the containers or accident scenarios, unnecessary shipments. We've got maps of the country depending where it would go, but people all across the country would be affected. I think there's only maybe 4 or 5 states in the U.S. that wouldn't have nuclear shipments.
So, over and over again, we get the question, so what then? Burial's a bad idea. So what do we do with the waste? Well, by default, not through, I think, necessarily any great influence of the civil society organizations, industry's own failures have brought us to a point where there are no repositories, even on the near horizon. And this, I think, has led to a discussion internationally, which Canada is pretty much absent from, and in the sort of the regulator circle, International Atomic Energy Agency and so on, there is increasingly a discussion of extending on-site storage. So, and that's from a couple of factors, a couple of influences there, no repositories on site, increasing pressure at reactor communities to move the waste, and the reactor communities have been told that the waste will go away. Something that, we take exception to as a community's a distance from the reactors who have been repeatedly told that we'll get the waste. But there is an active international discussion about extending on-site storage. And some of the criteria then for extended, in Canada, we've been largely absent from that discussion. The only real examination of extended on-site storage in Canada, there have been 2 sources. One, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was required to look at on-site storage as part of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, but they did a very perfunctory desktop exercise and basically said, yeah, there it is. There's also a study, a more interesting study, done by the CANDU Owners Group. When the industry in Canada wants to look at something, they just do it as a different organization. So while the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was supposed to look at on-site storage, they did a perfunctory desktop review. And the CANDU Owners Group, same companies, same owners, did a separate study. And it was a little more interesting, looking at how you would actually manage the waste on-site for a longer period of time. But the basic elements of on-site storage is you're looking for the waste to be, in the Canadian context, we would look for things like bringing the waste in from the shoreline. So in Canada, the reactors are, in Ontario, the reactors are all built on shorelines of the Great Lakes. And when you look at overhead shots of the reactor stations, it's quite striking. So you have the dry, even though we advocate that the fuel come from the pool to dry storage more quickly than it currently is being moved. When you look at the dry cask storage at the Canadian reactor stations, it's clearly not satisfactory in the long term, not even in the short term. You look at the Pickering station, for example. The dry cask storage is sort of a warehouse-type building, kind of the same specifications as you'd have for a furniture store or Staples, the office supply. And it's built, it appears from an overhead shot to have been a kind of a constructed peninsula literally out into the lake. That's where the dry cask storage is. So clearly you want to move those waste containers in from the shore. You want to have them hardened, and Dee's going to talk a little bit more about that. You want to have them dispersed. So you're looking for it's not a status quo arrangement. We're not talking about leaving it as is in as-is condition. It's got to be an active program. And we've done just a couple of papers. Northwatch has done a very brief paper about extended on-site storage and some early thinking about how it might apply in Canada. And the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility has done a paper on rolling stewardship. And these 2 ideas kind of combine to look at what do we do in real terms. The industry has a fairy tale, no offense to fairies, but a fairy tale about geological repository, and that's going to be the solution. And I think as a civil society organizations, we need to take a harder approach than the industry has been allowed to take, and we need to say, in real terms, in real time, how do we make the waste more secure? on site. And there are some basic elements: bring it in from the shore, disperse it, and harden it. And in the US, they actually have a more tangible proposal that has come from civil society organizations, and Dee's going to talk about that.
Hardened on-site storage. It's kind of too bad that hardened off-site storage would have the same acronym, but our intent is hardened on-site storage at the site of generation, with very few exceptions that really can't stay there. But the public interest communities, environmental groups across the whole country, every state, hundreds of groups have signed on to the principles. I've got a copy of the principles here for people to take, along with a copy of the basic problems with Yucca Mountain. But the principles for safeguarding waste at reactors has several basic points. It would require moving the fuel that's in the pools back to its original low-density amount. I mean, I feel like it needs to say, don't put any more fuel into the pools. I couldn't quite get that in there, but so that we could get all kinds of groups to be participating together. The goal of the principles is to take away the immediate danger of overloaded fuel pools and move it into low density as originally designed, move the fuel into dry storage, and protect the pools, protect the containers, to have the containers be in an array that is not easily attackable. There would be resistance to severe attacks, such as high explosive or weapons or munitions directed at them. Placement of the canisters that makes detection difficult from outside the site boundary. And protecting the pools, periodic review of the hardened on-site storage facilities and pools, dedicated funding to the local governments and communities to do independent monitoring, and prohibiting the reprocessing of irradiated fuel. So those principles are ones that we have pushed with our it's an option that we brought to the Blue Ribbon Commission that was completely ignored. Their only idea is that we need to move it, get the liability away from the private corporations, and they could use similar technology to store on site as they're proposing to store in a centralized place. All a centralized place does is to add one more dump. And so anyway, the person who originally designed this idea, developed it, is Gordon Thompson, and he's got some more specifics about it. And like I said, we've got the proposals here, we've got the groups listed on our website. And I think we should open to questions, 'cause basically that's what we're pushing for. One more thing on the casks, though, is that in the U.S. we have thin-walled casks, and there's begun to be a serious concern that our casks in the U.S. that are licensed, are certified, are not going to last but maybe 30 years before they get cracks, some of them. And so we're going to have to recontainerize the casks, and we're trying to explore. The European casks are thicker. We're not outright advocating them. We're advocating stop making more fuel. We're looking at, are there better ways to secure what we've already made? Okay. No, so we'll open to questions.
Yeah. So thanks. Are you facilitating?
No, we've got 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Too much. Okay.
My name is Erica Vincent. I'm a professor at Western University in London, close to Bruce. I have not been able to figure out, and I cannot get an answer to this question, and you're the best people to ask. Let's say the DGR goes ahead.
DGR 1? Mm-hmm.
What is the chance of the United States government leveraging Canada to move its low-level and intermediate-level waste up to the DGR because it costs so much for us to build it?
Well, we actually looked at this a few years ago at the request of one of the municipalities who were being studied by the NWMO. One of the issues they raised was the question of import. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, they're not silent on this. They're ambiguous. They have a paper and they say, well, we don't really know. So there's two different things. There's conventions. There's an international convention, which is not legally binding, which says countries will be responsible for their own waste. And then there's trade law. And under trade law, under the North American Free Trade Agreement, waste is considered a good. And under trade law, we cannot exclusively offer a service to Canadian corporations that we don't offer to US. And something that we need to really track is the instances of trafficking of nuclear waste. So we've got, overall, we don't think that we send it back and forth, but we do. We send some low-level waste from the Blind River refinery, uranium refinery, to the US, to Utah. We have some highly enriched liquid uranium from the Chalk River facility that is slated for transport to Savannah River. Big issue. We could do a day on that. So we really need to track these. In my view, each of these instances of trafficking and trade in waste makes us more vulnerable to that scenario because we're setting precedents.
I want to say something real quick.
Sure.
We have a couple of dumps in the U.S. that will compete for the waste, and they wouldn't want to give the business to somebody else. So you can feel comfortable that Waste Control won't want them to send it up to anywhere else. But on our high-level waste, that's another issue. We were worried over the years about if they were to get something in Canada first, whether we would maybe stick it.
Yeah, it's been a good presentation, and every question you've asked there, my name is Greg Nagel, and I'm from Tucson territory.
Ah.
And what always comes into play when you're talking about any kind of waste is NIMBY principle, right? Mm-hmm. It's all right, but not in my backyard. And there's a few complexities that are involved here that you haven't mentioned. One is that low-level waste, intermediate-level waste are categorized different in Canada than international standards. Mm-hmm. So our intermediate-level waste could be high-level waste. It could have a lifespan of 30,000 years. Mm-hmm. You have to categorize it as intermediate-level waste, which is supposed to go into a repository. Also, low-level and intermediate-level are under the guidance of the province, and all of a sudden they brought in this other organization called Nuclear Waste Management, which is federal, right? And they're all both under the same regulator, the CNSC, right? So as a First Nation, and if you could put one of the maps back on, and we're going to be sitting down and parleying with other tribal organizations in the country.
Very beginning of this.
Yeah.
Do we
Because,
Yeah, we do. Did I do it? Sorry, Greg.
Our biggest concern for any kind of dump.
Want that map?
Is that going to work?
So Greg is here. This is Son territory.
Yeah, that's that whole peninsula. So what we've always said is, why would you put any kind of waste near the biggest freshwater system in the world? So I haven't heard anyone speak to that, but why? Like, we're having a hard time when we try to get up to snuff on all the issues around nuclear waste. And it's one thing to say, put things in a hard container above ground.
Yeah.
And if you think any terrorist group in this country doesn't have the ability to find out where that is or how you explode it, you're dreaming. One of my biggest concerns is right now at both places is that you have high-level waste, fuel bundles above ground. Mm-hmm. You have Douglas Point, which has been decommissioned now for 20 years. It's just got its license as a decommissioned nuke plant, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, we went through we've tried to look at this from every angle or whatever, but you know, I mean, there's so many complexities to this here issue.
Mhm.
And the lady from the University of Western Ontario that asked about would the United States be able to bring waste into the Deep Geological Repository. Well, we have to face the fact now that waste comes into our territory monthly from Pickering and Darlington.
That's right.
Low-level and intermediate level waste keep coming into our territory. And we keep saying you're just making a complex problem more complicated. Like, let's find some kind of resolution to how we're going to deal with waste before you start stockpiling everything into our territory, which, if anything goes wrong, where do we go? You know, so our concerns are deep, but I think that every concern that you've had that we've taken to OPG and Bruce Power and the NWMO.
Yeah.
Right, but we're not trying to defend any kind of a system because we haven't agreed with it yet. But I think the biggest players in the country are the First Nations because that's our traditional territory. And if we say that you aren't putting contamination, nuclear waste in our territory, I can guarantee you it's not going to happen.
And Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, who Greg is a member of, was an incredibly effective intervener. We had a 33-day hearing on the proposal to bury the so-called low and intermediate level waste. And we're expecting a decision from that by May 6th. And San was just an incredible intervener. We see that, we call it DGR1s or DGR1. It's really the poster child in Canada. I think OPG thought they had a quick run through. They'd get an approval. They had a captured community. And it has proven, you know, and I think largely due to the efforts of Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, much more challenging than OPG anticipated. And that is all good.
I know we're almost done, but I just have to. So low level is not low risk. So don't ever let it come out of a workshop that I'm in that low is short lasting, or that, I mean, low level waste is dangerous. Some of it might be short, but it's got all the dangerous elements in it. Even the low level in the Class A in the US is hazardous for literally millions of years because of the iodines and the plutonium that's in it. So I fully agree with you on that. And transport is going to make the terrorist dangers even worse when you've got all these shipments on the road.